that if the victim would have been more cautious pulling out into traffic, she would not have been hit by the bus and would not have died. And she would have proceeded more cautiously into the traffic had she not been escaping a carjacking that was being conducted by the defendant. So her just jetting out into traffic was dependent on the actions of the defendant who was trying to carjack her. Now let's compare that to an independent intervening cause, sometimes called a superseding cause. This is one that could not be intended or reasonably foreseen by the defendant. Say, for example, that Joe is stabbed by Larry. Larry inflicts only one minor injury before Joe flees the scene. Joe then goes to the hospital for treatment. While Joe is waiting for treatment in the hospital, a disgruntled former employee pulls a gun and begins shooting everyone in sight. Joe is killed. Would it be reasonable to conclude that Larry was the proximate cause of Joe's death? Probably not. He could not have reasonably foreseen that a crazed gunman would enter the hospital waiting room and begin shooting. So there we have an independent intervening cause, someone coming into the hospital and shooting that caused the victim's death. And that act was independent of the act that was performed by Larry. So that is an example of an independent intervening cause. Other aspects of causation, we just talked about this, direct causation versus an intervening cause. And then we have what is called the apparent safety doctrine, which is very important as well. This doctrine holds that a defendant is not the legal cause of a resulting harm if the victim reaches a place of apparent safety, at which point an intervening cause of harm comes into play. And your book highlights a case to illustrate this, State versus Pressler. A man had an argument with his wife, beat her, and later drove her away from the home and left her close to her father's house. Instead of entering her father's house, the woman decided to sleep outside in the cold. She froze to death during the night. Was the husband held criminally liable for her death? He was not, because of the apparent safety doctrine. He had gotten her to a place of apparent safety, her father's house. So therefore, anything that happened after he got her to that safe location is not on him. He would be absolved of all criminal liability for anything that happened after he got her to that safe place. Okay. Those are the last slides from the PowerPoint that I'm going to discuss before I get into your discussion questions that pertain to your discussions 1.2 and 1.3. So your first discussion question dealt with Brennan and his wife Carrie, and it is labeled as your discussion 3.3 in your textbook. And I really liked this problem because it was very cut and dry, very cookie cutter problem. There's only one answer for this problem. There's no wiggle room where you could go this way or this way. There's just one correct answer. So let's go through this problem, Brennan recently learned that his wife, Carrie, was having an affair with her personal trainer. Enraged, Brennan decides that he wants to kill Carrie and throw her body into the river. He even stays up late at night, writing in his journal and planning out her death. The next morning, Brennan has a change of heart. He decides he would rather divorce Carrie and try to get a large alimony check every month instead of committing murder. As he is pulling out of the garage on his way to work, however, he accidentally runs Carrie over as she is retrieving the morning paper. Carrie dies as a result of her injuries. Brennan is charged with first-degree murder, which requires a specific intent to kill. Is he guilty of first-degree murder? Why or why not? The correct answer, of course, is no. Brennan is not guilty of first-degree murder. And this is because we have the actus reus, which is the act of Brennan running Carrie over with his car. But what is entirely missing from this scenario is the mens rea, the mind. There was no guilty mind on Brennan's part. There was no intent on Brennan's part to kill Carrie. As the problem indicates, murder is a specific intent crime. You have to specifically intend the consequences of your actions for specific intent crimes, which means that Brennan would have had to specifically intend to kill Carrie by running her over with his car. Now, I chose this problem because I want you to understand how important it is to pay attention to the facts and to not be fooled by the facts of the problem. So, he learns that his wife is having an affair. He's mad. He decides that he wants to kill her. He stays up late at night. He writes this in his journal. He plans this out, okay? So there's premeditation, there's deliberation. But the next morning comes and he has a change of heart. He no longer wants to kill her. He doesn't intend on killing her anymore. He now wants to go a different route. He now wants to divorce her and collect alimony every month. So, with that being said, there's no longer the thoughts in his head to kill her. That mens rea, that specific intent, it's no longer there. And it even tells you in the facts that as he is pulling out of the garage on his way to work, he accidentally runs her over as she is retrieving the morning paper. This was an accident. It was an accident. He did not intend to kill her. Okay, so murder is defined, and even though the definition of murder was not listed in chapter 3, which is where this question came from, murder is the unlawful killing of another human being with malice aforethought. And malice aforethought is pretty much the intent to commit the murder and to kill this person. None of those things were present here. So we have the actus reus, but we don't have the mens rea. This was an accident. And like I said, or maybe I didn't say it before, but you can't act accidentally and intentionally at the same time. That's impossible. You have to act intentionally in order to be charged with first-degree murder. And in this case, Brennan did not act intentionally. He abandoned his plan to kill Carrie. He no longer wanted to do that. He wanted her to stay alive so that he could get alimony from her. And when he killed her by running over her with his car, that was purely accidental, and thus prohibits him from being able to be charged with first-degree murder. Now, many of you listed alternate charges or alternate crimes for which Brennan could have been charged, which was great. It let me see that, your mind was going, the wheels in your head were turning, and you were able to acknowledge that he can be charged, but just with a lower crime. So just the fact that this was an accident doesn't mean that he gets to walk off free. He's still going to be charged with a crime. It's just not going to be first degree murder. Now, what I found to be very interesting was that one of you, or perhaps some of you, had listed in your answer that he can be charged with first degree murder because there's no way for us to know that this was really an accident and what have you. Now, in the real world, that may be true. Okay. In the real world, someone could say it's an accident. There's really no way for us to know that it was an accident. We just have to go with the evidence that's there. But for all intents and purposes in this course, you are to hold out the facts as true. Never second guess the facts, because that will drive you crazy. So that is, if the problem says that he accidentally runs Carrie over, then it was an accident. He accidentally run her over. If the problem says the next morning he has a change of heart, you take that as true. And you go with that. The next morning he has a change of heart. Don't get into the habit of saying, oh, there's no way for us to prove that he had a change of heart, or there's no way for us to prove that it was an accident. The facts are not here to trick you. Okay, these are the facts that you have to use in your analysis to come to your conclusion. So for the purpose of this class, whatever facts are listed in a question, those are the facts that you're going to go with. Okay, so with that being said, this was an accident. He abandoned his plan to murder Carrie. There was no specific intent there. The mens rea element was not satisfied. Therefore, Brennan could not be charged with first degree murder. Now we move on to your second discussion question, discussion 1.3. And I really enjoyed this question, which is why I chose it for you all, because it's not as clear cut as the other question. This one was designed to make you think and to really make sure that you were reading the material and that you understood the material that you were reading. This question could kind of go either way based on the doctrine that you decided to use and based on how persuasive your arguments were. There's no straight cut answer in this one. It actually gave you a chance to be creative using the different doctrines that were listed in your book. So let's go through this one. It says Brian convinces his friend Joe, who prefers to stay home and play video games all day, to go for a hike in the woods one sunny afternoon. During the hike, Brian jokingly pushes Joe, and Joe falls over a ravine and suffers severe injuries. Feeling terrible, Brian carries Joe on his back all the way to the nearest hospital and leaves him in the emergency room. After Brian leaves, Joe decides to go to the restroom under his own power and passes out. Joe eventually dies from internal bleeding in the emergency room bathroom. Is Brian the proximate cause of Joe's death? Why or why not? Explain what doctrine, if any, applied. Okay. Now, in this one, we know that we are dealing with the proximate cause issues. Okay, so We're not going to address